In the cold, dark heart of a Krool prison ship, Jax was about to face his death sentence. They called it Cell 404. A place where the most feral monsters were kept to starve and go mad. No prisoner had ever lasted more than 10 minutes inside. The guards expected a bloodbath, but Jax didn't scream. He didn't run. He knew that in the wild, fear is an invitation to die. That he gave them the only thing they hadn't felt in years, peace. And a reason to trust. Days later, the guards returned for a corpse. Instead, they found a family that would tear the galaxy apart to stay together. The heavy metal door of Cell 404 slammed shut with a sound that echoed like a death bell. Jax stood in the darkness, his back against the cold, vibrating wall of the alien prison ship. The air inside the cell was thick and smelled of old blood and wild animals. Outside the small observation window, he could hear the Krool guards laughing. They had told him that no human had ever lasted more than 10 minutes inside this room. They called it the lion's den, but the creatures inside were much worse than lions. They were Felidians, alien catgirls who had been turned into mindless monsters by years of torture and hunger. Jax stayed perfectly still. He did not move a muscle. In the corners of the dark room, he saw them. 6 glowing, yellow eyes stared at him from the shadows. He heard a low, vibrating growl that seemed to shake the very floor beneath his boots. The Felidians were moving slowly, circling him like sharks in deep water. They were tall, with long, powerful limbs, messy fur, and claws that looked sharp enough to slice through steel. Their clothes were nothing but rags, and their bodies were covered in scars. To the Krool guards, these were just feral beasts, but Jax looked at them and saw something different. He saw pain. Most people in this situation would have screamed. They would have begged for mercy or tried to kick the door down. But Jax knew that in the wild, fear is an invitation to die. He remembered the words of his grandfather, a man who had spent his life exploring dangerous planets. Jax, his grandfather had told him, never run from a predator. If you run, you are prey. If you fight, you are an enemy. But if you stay calm, you are a mystery. Jax took a deep breath, forcing his heart rate to slow down. He didn't want to be prey, and he didn't want to be an enemy. Instead of reaching for a weapon or preparing to punch, Jax did something that shocked the creatures. He slowly slid down the wall and sat on the freezing metal floor. He crossed his legs and rested his hands on his knees. He looked down at the ground, showing them that he was not a threat. Then, he began to hum. It wasn't a loud song, just a low, steady sound from his chest. It was a simple lullaby his mother used to sing back on Earth. The sound was warm and rhythmic. It was a sound of peace in a place that had only known violence for years. The growling stopped instantly. The 3 Felidians froze in their tracks. This was not what they expected. Every other prisoner the Krool threw into this cell had reacted with loud noises and jerky movements. Those prisoners had triggered their hunting instincts. But this human was different. He was quiet. He was still. He was making a sound that didn't feel like a challenge. The Felidians tilted their heads, their long, pointed ears twitching. They were confused. Their predatory minds were trying to understand why this small, soft-looking human wasn't afraid of them. The largest of the 3, a female with silver-gray fur and deep scars on her shoulders, stepped out of the shadows. She was the leader, the most dangerous of the group. She moved with a terrifying grace, her claws clicking against the metal floor. She approached Jax until she was only a few inches away. She leaned down, her face right in front of his. Jax could feel her hot, meat-scented breath on his cheek. He could see the sharp fangs peeking out from her lips. His heart wanted to jump out of his chest, but he kept humming. He kept his body relaxed. He didn't look her in the eyes yet, as that could be seen as a challenge. The leader sniffed him. She smelled the dust of the space docks, the grease of ship engines, and the strange, salty scent of a human. But she didn't smell fear. Usually, the scent of fear was like a drug to her, making her want to bite and tear. Without that scent, she felt a strange emotion she hadn't felt in a long time, curiosity. She reached out a hand, her long, black claws hovering just an inch from Jax's throat. One small movement and his life would be over. The guards watching through the camera held their breath, waiting for the blood to spray, but Jax had one more card to play. He knew the Krool kept these girls starving to make them more aggressive. Slowly, so slowly that it almost looked like he wasn't moving at all, Jax reached into the hidden pocket of his jacket. The two Felidians in the back hissed, thinking he was reaching for a knife. The leader bared her teeth, ready to strike. Jax stopped. He opened his hand slowly to show them he was holding something small and brown. It was a high-protein ration bar, made of real dried meat. It was the only food he had been given for the last 2 days. He didn't throw it. He didn't drop it. He gently placed it on the floor between his boots and the leader's feet. He then looked up, meeting the leader's yellow eyes with a look of pure kindness. He didn't say a word, but his eyes said everything. I am not your master, and I am not your food. I am your friend. The leader looked down at the meat, then back at Jax. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it might snap. The feral catgirl, the monster of cell 404, stared at the first gift anyone had given her in years. The leader of the Felidian stared at the small piece of meat on the floor. For a long minute, she did not move. Her tail flicked behind her like a whip, and her eyes were fixed on the ration bar. She was fighting a war inside her own mind. Her stomach was screaming with hunger, but her memory was screaming with caution. In this prison, everything was a trap. Every time a guard approached, it meant pain or a shock from a light staff. She looked at Jax's face. He was still humming that low, soft tune. His eyes were calm, and his hands were open and visible. He looked nothing like the Krool guards who kicked them and called them beasts. Slowly, the leader reached out. Her long, black claws scraped against the metal floor as she picked up the meat. She didn't eat it immediately. She sniffed it deeply, her nose twitching. Then, in one quick motion, she tossed it into her mouth. Jax watched as her expression changed. It wasn't the chemical-filled mush the guards usually threw into the cage, it was real protein. Her ears stood up straight, and for a second, the growl in her throat turned into a different sound, a short, sharp chirp of surprise. She looked at the other two Felidians behind her and made a low clicking sound. It was a signal. The other two girls, one with orange-striped fur and a smaller one with dark black fur, slowly crept out of the shadows. Jax knew this was the most dangerous moment. If he moved too fast now, they would think he was trying to grab them. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out 2 more small ration bars. He didn't have much food left for himself, but he knew that winning their trust was more important than his own hunger. He split the bars into smaller pieces and held them out in his open palms. The orange-striped girl hissed at him, showing her teeth, but the leader walked over and stood right in front of Jax. She looked at his hands, then at his face. She seemed to be searching for a lie, but Jax just smiled a tired, honest smile. The leader took a piece from his hand. Her whiskers touched his skin, and Jax felt a shiver go down his spine. Her touch was soft, like velvet, but he knew the power behind those muscles. Once she took the first piece, the other two girls rushed forward. They weren't attacking him, they were reaching for the food. For a few minutes, the only sound in the dark cell was the sound of 3 hungry girls eating. Jax sat there, surrounded by 3 of the galaxy's most feared predators, and he felt a strange sense of peace. He realized that these monsters were just lonely, scared children who had been treated like garbage for too long. Meanwhile, in the control room, the Krool guards were losing their minds. They stared at the blurry monitors in disbelief. They couldn't see exactly what was happening because of the shadows, but they could see that the human was still alive. Why aren't they killing him? One guard barked, slamming his fist on the desk. They should have torn him apart by now. Another guard checked the sensors. The human's heart rate is low. He's not even scared. And the Felidians, their adrenaline levels are dropping. They are calming down. This made the guards angry. They didn't want a peaceful cell, they wanted a bloodbath for their evening entertainment. The head guard, a large lizard with a jagged scar across his snout, growled. If they won't fight on their own, we will make them fight. He reached for a control panel and turned a dial. Suddenly, a loud, piercing screeching sound filled cell 404. It was a high-frequency noise designed to hurt the sensitive ears of the Felidians. It was a torture tool the Krool used to drive the girls into a killing frenzy. The effect was instant. The 3 girls fell to the floor, clutching their ears and screaming in pain. Their eyes turned bright red again, and they began to lash out blindly, their claws hitting the walls and the floor. Jax felt the vibration of the sound in his own head, but for the Felidians, it was 10 times worse. The smallest girl, the one with black fur, began to shake violently. She was trapped in a corner, crying out as the sound tore through her brain. The leader was trying to stand up, but the pain was too much. She looked at Jax, and for the first time, he saw a look of pure terror in her eyes. She thought Jax had done this. She thought that friend had betrayed her. She bared her fangs and prepared to pounce on him, thinking he was the source of her pain. Jax didn't run. He knew that if he didn't do something, they would lose all the trust he had just built. He ignored the pain in his own ears and crawled toward the leader. He grabbed her hands, not to fight, but to hold them. He pulled her toward him and wrapped his heavy, insulated jacket over her head to muffle the sound. He then pulled the other 2 girls into the circle, using his own body as a shield. He held them tight, pressing their ears against his chest and covering them with his arms and his clothes. He hummed as loud as he could, trying to give them a different sound to focus on. The girls struggled at first, their claws digging into Jax's arms and back. He felt the sting of blood running down his skin, but he didn't let go. He whispered, "It's okay. I've got you. Just listen to my heart. Focus on me." Slowly, the girls stopped fighting. They realized that inside Jax's embrace, the noise was quieter. They pressed their faces into his chest, shivering. The human, who was supposed to be their prey, was now the only thing protecting them from the agony. In the control room, the guards watched in total silence. They had never seen anything like this. A human was protecting the beasts from the masters. The high-frequency noise finally stopped, leaving a ringing silence in the dark cell. The Krool guards in the control room were furious. They had expected the human to be shredded into pieces, but instead, they saw a sight that made no sense to their cruel minds. Jax was still sitting there, his arms wrapped around the 3 trembling Felidians. His jacket was torn, and blood from small scratches stained his shirt, but he was alive. The guards didn't understand empathy, they only understood power. To them, Jax was a broken toy that wouldn't break correctly. The lead guard growled and pushed a different button on the console. "If they want to be close," the guard hissed, "let's see how they like the frost." Slowly, the low hum of the ship's life support changed. The air vents didn't blow fresh air anymore. Instead, a blast of freezing nitrogen-chilled gas began to fill the room. In the deep vacuum of space, heat is a luxury, and the Krool were now stealing it away from cell 404. Within minutes, the metal walls began to glisten with a thin layer of white frost. Jax could see his own breath in front of his face, forming thick clouds of mist. He shivered, pulling his arms tighter around himself. Humans are warm-blooded, which means they can survive a lot, but even a human has limits. However, for the Felidians, the situation was much more dangerous. The Felidians were evolved from desert predators. Their bodies were built for speed and agility, not for the freezing cold. As the temperature dropped toward 0, their movements became slow and heavy. Their heart rates began to fall. The orange-striped girl started to shake so hard her teeth clicked together. The smallest girl, the black-furred one, curled into a tiny ball, her breathing becoming shallow and weak. The leader tried to stand up to growl at the vents, but her legs gave out, and she slumped against Jax's side. They were slipping into a cold-induced sleep, a sleep from which they might never wake up. Jax realized what was happening. He knew that in the world of biology, humans were like walking furnaces. He produced enough body heat to keep himself alive, but if he shared it, he might be able to save them too. He didn't hesitate. He sat back against the far wall, where the frost hadn't reached yet. He opened his heavy outer coat wide. "Come here," he whispered, his voice cracking from the cold. He didn't use a command, he used an invitation. He patted his chest and his lap. He knew the girls were fading fast, and their natural instincts for survival would soon take over their fear of him. The leader was the first to move. She felt the incredible heat coming off the human. To her, Jax was no longer a person, he was a sun. She crawled toward him, her movements clumsy and stiff. She collapsed against his chest, burying her face in the crook of his neck. Jax felt her icy skin and the way her body felt like a block of stone. He immediately wrapped his coat and his strong arms around her. Next, the orange-striped girl and the smallest one followed the warmth. They crowded around him, pushing their bodies against his stomach and legs, trying to soak up every bit of heat he was giving off. The suspense in the room was heavy. Jax was now the only thing standing between these three girls and death. He felt his own toes going numb, and his fingers were starting to lose feeling. He knew that by saving them, he was putting himself at great risk. If the guards kept the temperature this low for another hour, his own heart might stop. But he didn't move. He began to rub their arms and backs, trying to keep their blood flowing. He spoke to them in a soft, steady voice, telling them stories of Earth, of green forests, and of the warm sun that never stopped shining. He didn't know if they understood the words, but they understood the love in his voice. After a while, something incredible happened. The leader began to make a sound. It wasn't a growl or a scream. It was a deep, rhythmic vibration that started in her chest and echoed through Jax's own body. She was purring. Soon, the other two joined in. The sound was so loud it almost drowned out the hum of the ship. In the Felidian culture, purring wasn't just for happiness, it was a way to heal. Their bodies were reacting to Jax's kindness. The heat was returning to their limbs, and their eyes, once filled with feral rage, were now closed in a peaceful, trusting sleep. In the control room, the guards were staring at a heat sensor screen. Usually, the screen showed 4 distinct blue shapes when the room was cold. But now, they saw only one giant, glowing red blob in the center of the cell. The human and the monsters had become one single source of life. The guards were confused and slightly afraid. They had tried to break them with sound, and they had tried to kill them with cold, but the human's weakness, his heart, was turning their prison into a fortress. The head guard narrowed his eyes. "Open the doors tomorrow morning," he ordered. "If the human is still alive, I will kill him myself." The cycle of the ship's artificial sun began to hum, signaling a new day, but inside cell 404, it was still dark and silent. The ice on the walls had started to melt, turning into small drops of water that dripped onto the floor. Jax was exhausted. He had spent the entire night fighting off sleep, knowing that if he lost his focus, his body temperature might drop too low. His muscles were stiff, and his legs felt like lead, but he didn't move. He couldn't move. The 3 Felidian girls were still deeply asleep, their bodies piled on top of him. The smallest one was curled up on his lap, while the leader and the orange-striped girl were leaning against his chest, their heads resting on his shoulders. The loud, vibrating purring had slowed down to a soft, rhythmic pulse. For the first time in years, these girls felt safe. Outside the heavy door, the sound of heavy metal boots suddenly broke the silence. The Krool guards were coming. Usually, the Felidians would wake up at this sound and rush to the corners, ready to hiss and bite. But this time, they didn't move away from Jax. Instead, as the sound of the boots grew louder, the leader's ears twitched. She didn't jump away in fear. She opened her golden eyes and looked at Jax. There was no madness in her gaze anymore. She looked at the human who had fed her, protected her from the noise, and kept her warm during the freezing night. She let out a low, soft chirp, signaling the other two to wake up. They didn't run to the shadows. They stayed right there, surrounding Jax like a living shield. The heavy mechanical locks of the door began to turn with a loud clank clank clank. The head guard, the one with the jagged scar on his face, stood in the hallway with 4 other guards. They were all holding high-voltage shock prods and heavy net guns. They expected to walk into a room filled with blood and the smell of death. They expected to find the humans' remains scattered across the floor. The head guard had a cruel smile on his face. He wanted to show his subordinates that no one, especially not a weak human, could survive his monsters. He signaled his men to be ready, and with a hiss of pressurized air, the door slid open. The guards stepped into the room, their weapons raised. But then, they stopped. They froze in their tracks, their mouths hanging open in total shock. The sight before them was something that should have been impossible. They didn't see a dead human. They didn't see feral beasts tearing at meat. They saw Jax, sitting calmly against the wall, looking tired but very much alive. And draped over him, like a royal guard, were the 3 most dangerous prisoners on the ship. The Felidians weren't attacking Jax, they were leaning against him, their eyes fixed on the guards with a look of cold, intelligent fury. The leader stood up slowly, her body positioned directly between Jax and the guards. She bared her long fangs and let out a growl so deep it made the guard's armor vibrate. "What is this?" the head guard screamed, his voice cracking with confusion and anger. "Get away from him. Kill him." He stepped forward, raising his shock prod to strike. Usually, the Felidians would cower when they saw the glowing blue electricity of the prod. They had been beaten with it hundreds of times. But today was different. Today, they weren't fighting for themselves, they were protecting the person who had shown them the first bit of kindness they had ever known. Before the guard could even swing his weapon, the orange-striped girl leaped forward with a speed that was almost invisible to the eye. She didn't attack like a wild animal, she attacked like a soldier. She swiped the shock prod out of the guard's hand with one claw and pushed him back with a powerful kick. The other guards tried to fire their net guns, but the smallest Felidian was already moving, sliding across the floor and tripping them. The coordination was perfect. Jax watched in amazement as the 3 girls moved like a single unit. They weren't just cat girls anymore, they were a pack. They didn't kill the guards, not yet, but they stood their ground, forming a semicircle around Jax. The leader turned her head slightly to look at Jax, giving him a small, feline nod. It was a clear message: you protected us last night. We protect you now. The head guard scrambled to his feet, his face turning a dark shade of purple with rage. He couldn't believe his eyes. His beasts were taking orders from a human. His prize fighters had turned into bodyguards. He looked at Jax, who was now slowly standing up, his hand resting on the leader's shoulder. The guard realized that something had changed in cell 404. The power dynamic of the entire ship had shifted in just one night. Jax looked at the guard, his eyes cold and determined. "I told you," Jax said, his voice calm but firm, "you shouldn't have locked me in here with them. But not for the reason you think." The head guard stood paralyzed, his eyes darting between Jax and the 3 Felidian girls. In all his years of running this prison ship, he had never seen anything like this. To him, the Felidians were weapons of war, violent, unpredictable, and full of hate. He had spent months breaking their spirits with hunger and pain. Now, seeing them stand as protectors for a single, unarmed human was like seeing a nightmare come to life. The guard's hand shook as he reached for his communicator. "Reinforcements to Sector 4, he screamed. "The human has corrupted the specimens. I repeat, the human has taken control of the beasts." Jax didn't look like a man who had taken control. He looked like a man who had simply survived. He was tired, his clothes were dusty, and he had small scratches on his arms from the night before. But as he stood there, the leader of the Felidians leaned her head against his shoulder for a brief second. It was a gesture of deep trust. The guards watching through the cameras in the control room zoomed in on Jax's chest. They could see the marks where the girls had rested their heads all night. His shirt was covered in their silver and black fur. To the Krool, this was a sign of filth, but to anyone else, it was a sign of a bond that could not be broken by steel or fire. More guards arrived, their heavy boots thumping against the metal floor. They formed a line in the hallway, pointing their energy rifles at the small group inside the cell. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and fear. "Step away from the human," the head guard ordered the Felidians, his voice trembling with rage. "He is a prisoner. He is nothing." The leader of the catgirls didn't move an inch. She stood tall, her muscles tensed like a spring ready to snap. She didn't need words to tell the guards that if they wanted to get to Jax, they would have to go through her first. Jax stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the leader's arm. He felt her heartbeat. It was fast, but steady. "They don't understand," Jax said, his voice echoing in the quiet hallway. "You think you kept them feral to make them strong. But you only made them lonely. All they needed was a reason to fight, and now they have one." The head guard laughed, a cruel, dry sound. "A reason? You think a few scraps of meat and some body heat makes you a leader? You are just a soft human. You are weak." The guard raised his rifle, aiming it directly at Jax's heart. The suspense in the room reached a breaking point. The smallest Felidian girl let out a high-pitched whistle, a sound used by her people to signal an ambush. Before the guard could pull the trigger, the lights in the hallway began to flicker and die. Jax had realized earlier that the girls' constant scratching at the walls wasn't just madness, they had been weakening the power cables for weeks. With one final pull, the orange-striped girl ripped a panel from the wall, causing a massive electrical spark. The hallway plunged into total darkness. In the dark, the Krool guards were blind. Their eyes were not built for the shadows. But the Felidians were different. Their yellow eyes glowed like lanterns in the blackness. They could see every movement, every breath, and every heartbeat of the terrified guards. Jax felt a strong hand grab his jacket. It was the leader. She wasn't pulling him away, she was guiding him. For the first time, Jax wasn't the one doing the protecting. The girls were moving with a silent, deadly grace, taking down the guards one by one in the dark without firing a single shot. When the emergency red lights finally kicked in, the scene was completely different. The 5 guards were lying on the floor, their weapons broken and their spirits crushed. They weren't dead, but they were too terrified to move. Jax stood in the middle of the hallway, flanked by the 3 Felidians. The leader looked at Jax, her eyes searching his. She saw that he wasn't afraid of her, even after seeing what she could do in the dark. She reached out and touched his chest, right where she had slept just hours before. In that moment, the feral label was gone forever. They were no longer prisoners, they were a team. The alarms on the prison ship began to scream, a piercing sound that echoed through the metallic hallways. Red emergency lights flashed against the walls, making the shadows of Jax and the 3 Felidians look like dancing ghosts. The ship was now on full lockdown. Jax knew they didn't have much time. The Krool would soon send an entire army of armored soldiers to stop them. He looked at the 3 girls. Their fur was standing on end, and their ears were pinned back against their heads. They were ready for a fight, but Jax knew they couldn't win a war with just claws and teeth. They needed a plan, and they needed to reach the hangar deck before the Krool vented the air out of the sector. Jax pointed down the long corridor toward the command center. "We need to get to the escape pods," he whispered, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I can hack the door locks, but I need you to keep the guards away from me while I work." The leader of the Felidians, whom Jax had started to call Nova, in his mind, nodded. She understood. She grabbed a dropped shock-prod from the floor and handed it to the orange-striped girl. They were learning to use the very weapons that had once been used against them. As a pack, they began to move. They didn't run like panicked animals, they moved with the quiet, calculated precision of a human special forces team. As they reached the main junction, the heavy blast doors began to slide shut. "Hurry!" Jax shouted. He lunged forward, sliding across the floor and jamming a metal pipe into the closing mechanism. The door groaned and sparked, stopping just enough for them to squeeze through. On the other side, a squad of 10 Krool soldiers was waiting. They were wearing heavy bone armor and carrying high-powered pulse rifles. The guards didn't hesitate, they opened fire. Blue bolts of energy hissed through the air, hitting the walls and melting the metal. Jax dove behind a cargo crate, his heart drumming against his ribs. Then, he saw why the galaxy feared the Felidians. Nova and her sisters didn't hide. They moved so fast the human eye could barely follow them. They used the walls and the ceiling, jumping from one surface to another. The orange-striped girl tackled 2 guards at once, while the smallest one used her speed to snatch the rifles right out of the guards' hands. Nova stayed near Jax, her claws out, swiping away any guard who tried to get close to the brain of the operation. In less than a minute, the hallway was silent again. The Krool soldiers lay on the ground, defeated not by brute force, but by the sheer speed and fury of the girls protecting their friend. Finally, they reached the hangar. One lone escape pod was left, glowing under the dim lights. But standing in front of it was the Krool commander, a massive creature nearly 7 feet tall with thick, leathery skin. He held a heavy plasma cannon aimed directly at the pod. "If I cannot have my prizes," the commander hissed, "no one will leave this ship alive." He began to pull the trigger. Jax knew that if the pod was destroyed, they were all dead. Without thinking, Jax jumped in front of the girls. He stood tall, his arms spread wide. "Shoot me then," Jax yelled. "But let them go. They've suffered enough." They tumbled into the small pod just as the hangar doors blew open. Jax slammed the launch button, and with a powerful jolt, they were shot out into the cold, silent beauty of space. The prison ship grew smaller and smaller until it was just a tiny dot of light. Inside the pod, the silence was heavy. Jax slumped against the wall, breathing hard. He looked down and saw 3 pairs of glowing eyes watching him. Slowly, one by one, the girls crawled over to him. They didn't growl. They didn't hiss. They simply rested their heads on his lap and his chest, their purring filling the tiny cabin. Days later, a human rescue ship found the pod drifting near the edge of the sector. When the rescue team opened the hatch, they were terrified. They saw 3 of the galaxy's most dangerous predators inside. The soldiers raised their guns, but they stopped when they saw the man in the middle. Jax was fast asleep, looking peaceful and warm. The 3 feral monsters were curled around him, protecting him even in their sleep. One of the rescue soldiers lowered his gun and whispered, "I thought these things were killers." His captain looked at the way the girls held onto Jax's sleeves and replied, "They are. But it looks like they found something worth more than killing. They found a human."